G'day everyone, I'm Rowan Mackey and welcome to Individuate, the podcast where we use the vehicle of our own podcast to try and get the best out of ourselves in the service of others. Today, I want to start with some criticisms of an American president. No, not that American president. It's one you won't expect, but see if you can guess from these following comments. Extra points if you can guess exactly what famous event they're referring to. The Chicago Times wrote, "The cheeks of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, and dishwatery utterances." The Harrisburg Patriot and Union wrote, "We pass over the silly remarks of the president, willing that the veil of oblivion shall be dropped over them and that they shall no more be repeated or thought of." Another said, "It was a perversion of history so flagrant that the most extended charity cannot regard it as otherwise than willful." Now, they're pretty fired up comments, and these happen to be comments written in 1863 at the time of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. To me, the Gettysburg Address is probably the most eloquent collection of words that I've ever heard. Edward Everett, who spoke for almost 2 hours immediately before Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address, later said, "I should be glad that I should flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." History remembers these 272 words almost as fondly as any others, but in the minds of these particular opponents, they bordered on blasphemy. Now, I can't help to think that if you were a political opponent and public detractor of Lincoln, no matter what he said at that address, if it was in any way stirring, particularly if it was this stirring, this negative reaction would have been the response of some people no matter what. If we go back to episode 2 of the podcast and what we learnt about the shadow side, I can't help to think that these reactions are more of a negative projection than an honest appraisal. Now, I'll post the full article on the episode page for today, which you can find at www.easygoingdigital.com.au/individuate. But I want to read an excerpt from an article by the great-great-grandson of one of these famous Lincoln detractors, Oromel Barrett, editor of what was then called the Daily Patriot and Union. To the Lincoln bashers, the president was using Gettysburg to kick off his re-election campaign and showing the poor taste to do so at a memorial service. According to my bilious great-great-grandfather, he was performing in a panorama that was gotten up more for the benefits of his party than for the glory of the nation and the honour of the dead. To me, these are the words of someone who's had an emotional reaction to Lincoln's speech and doesn't want to admit to himself how stirred he was. Now, it could be a legitimate grievance if a political opponent misappropriates an apolitical event to launch their political campaign, but I think history quite rightly sees the Gettysburg Address as much more than that. It invoked much deeper notions, which most people obviously felt were appropriate for the occasion. So, what can we take from this? And how can we apply it to the idea of starting our own podcast? What stands out to me is that if there's a negative reaction, even to what's regarded as one of the most stirring speeches of all time, what won't receive a negative reaction? There's a quote from Winston Churchill that goes, "You have enemies? Good. That means you stood for something, some time in your life." And I think this speaks to those themes. No matter what we look to say or do, there will always be someone who projects their internal negativity onto you. It should never be prohibitive to putting our voice out there, because even if we choose not to do or say something, there'll be someone who sees that negatively too. It's part and parcel of life that we're going to experience this at times, and to me, if our main detractors are those who are projecting their own internal negativity onto us, it speaks to the value of what we're putting out there. I was speaking to one of my mentors recently, James Whitaker, from the Win the Day podcast, and he had a brilliant quote. He said, "Some days you're the pigeon, and some days you're the statue." It seems to me that if you feel like the statue, you're more likely to go out of your way to try and present yourself like a pigeon and try and make someone else the statue. The other interesting thing is that Lincoln himself felt that he failed in the speech. As he returned to his seat after the speech to only a small smattering of applause, he said, "That speech won't scour. which is what was said about a plough in the prairies when you couldn't get the mud to come off and re-shine the surface. Lincoln thought the shortness of the speech would leave people to dislike it and think it disrespectful. And even if the great Abraham Lincoln expressed dissatisfaction at how the Gettysburg Address landed, then when will anyone ever be truly satisfied with something they've done? There are earlier versions of the speech written in Lincoln's hand in the days before his address at Gettysburg, and it's clear from them how much he changed it and pained over its content. So that's what today's podcast is about. If we bring it back to the idea of starting our own podcast and projecting our own voice out into the world, we have to come to terms with the fact that we may experience some negativity, even internally. Hopefully, today's podcast can get across the notion that some people are just stuck in a negative headspace. It's no reflection on you or your podcast or your perspective if you experience some judgmental reactions. I've been thinking about what it would be like for Oromel Barrett and his fellow critics of Lincoln to hear the Gettysburg Address, and I really think it's an example of their shadow side in play. If we let these sorts of serial cynics and dissuaders influence whether or not we speak up and attempt to put ourselves out into the world, we never get anywhere. Even internally, if Abraham Lincoln is sitting there feeling foolish after the Gettysburg Address, I'd hate to think of what he thinks of something like this podcast. But at the same time, Lincoln was already an experienced and distinguished orator by the time he got to Gettysburg. If he'd allowed that negative self-reflection to stand in the way of his performing, he never would have been able to put in the reps needed to develop and improve as an orator anywhere near well enough to deliver the Gettysburg Address. What Lincoln realised is that as much as it can be uncomfortable to put ourselves out there, there's also a cost to inaction. If the only cost to action is our own negative self-talk and the projected negative self-talk of others who may be triggered at seeing people give it a crack, then surely the cost of inaction, not following through and not attempting to put our voice out there, is a much greater cost. It seems to me with something like putting your voice out there, inaction doesn't equal neutrality, it equals negativity. On the first episode of the podcast, I mentioned the quote from Stephen Pressfield about us having two lives, the life we live and the life left unlived within us. If we don't act on some of these deeper impulses to pursue our calling, the unlived life doesn't sit passive in the background, it grows and it festers and it affects the way that we go about other aspects of our life. And the problem with this negativity is that it becomes loud. It can be distracting and discouraging, but it's in choosing the positive path that we're actually able to make more of a difference. The thing about podcasting and allowing your perspective and identity to develop is that it seems to me that it helps you to rise above some of this stuff. As we go about creating more and more layers of our identity and continue further down the hero's journey, you come to recognise that some people may be stuck at different stages. I heard a flippant comment recently from one of my other mentors, Ronsley Vaz, of the Psychology of Entrepreneurship podcast. And he said something along the lines of, it's liberating to recognise when your ego gets involved, because you can also recognise how it motivates other people too. And to me, in many ways, it was such a profound comment because of how often we do communicate with our ego. It's only when we take our ego out of something and get to the deeper elements of our personality that we're able to properly appreciate things for what they are. And it's worth recognising that some people aren't there yet. But the more we're able to take our ego out of it, the more it allows us to recognise where we can be of service to others. If we go back to that idea of the hero's journey, the second step that we spoke about in episode 2 is the dark night of the soul. It seems to me that some people never get past this stage, and subconsciously they want others to join them, and so they project this negativity into the world, not realising how much of their deeper insecurities it really illuminates. Just look at how many people don't use their real name on Twitter. I really wonder whether this is where motifs of hell and the underworld have come from in literature and religion. To get stuck in the dark night of the soul is to experience hell or to live in the underworld, which is part of the reason that I think the context of the hero's journey is so important. But I digress. Something else that James Whittaker spoke about the other day was that he made the point that he sees two of the main indicators of success in life to be resourcefulness and resilience. And I think he has a point. People from all walks of life have achieved success when they've had these two characteristics. to me, exploring the idea of the hero's journey, and in this case, starting a podcast, is the best way to boost your resourcefulness and resilience. One thing that came up on the most recent episode of the Sykes, Bills and Silver Linings podcast that I do with my dad was the thought exercise of differentiating between the use of a capital I and a lowercase I when internally referring to yourself. We can get stuck in a trap of thinking that the capital I, as in me and my whole personality, comes to be represented by particular events that are significant to us. But in fact, our personality is made up of so much more than that. For example, if we have to give a big talk or put ourselves out there in a particular way, we can think, I, as in the big I, am giving this talk. Everyone I know will see it. They'll come to judge me, and if it doesn't go well, they'll think I'm a failure. But if we flip it into a little I and think that I am giving this talk, but it's only a little I, it's only one little aspect of my personality, and regardless of how it goes, I'll still have other aspects of my personality, other little I's which will also define me, such as who I am as a son, a brother, a friend, a partner, a podcaster, a golfer, a cook. I think you get the point. But the more I've thought about it, the more this process of podcasting links in with this idea of building your personality and identity, your big I, by undertaking a whole bunch of little I's, which can be represented as different podcast episodes. As you create each episode and develop your central themes and ideas further, each little I element of your personality that you discover adds to that idea of a bigger I. And I really wonder whether people who make cynical comments or overly negative judgments are struggling with their own concept of identity, their big I, and feel the subconscious desire to tear down others. I want to leave you with this concept I heard the other day from Darren O'Lean, which I think in many ways is the real point of all this. Darren is the co-host with Zac Efron of the widely popular Netflix docuseries Down to Earth with Zac Efron. And he's also host of the #1 health and wellness podcast, The Darren O'Lean Show. And I was lucky enough to hear him speak at the most recent We Are podcast conference. Darren's someone who's objectively successful. He's world famous, highly influential, highly connected, and is a highly regarded entrepreneur. So he's got the output side of things fairly well covered. But as Darren points out, I think this is the central theme of this whole podcast, it's not about you. It's not even about being a better version of yourself, or me trying to be a better version of myself. It's actually about everyone who has the opportunity to learn from you and gain your solutions. It's about your kids, or your future kids, or your family, who will benefit from having you project positivity around and for them. It's about your friends who may feel in a similar position to you and see what you're doing and be motivated to do something themselves. It's about anyone you'll inspire and anyone they'll inspire. It's about being a force for good. And if all that's standing in the way of that is fear and shame at putting our voice out there, then we're robbing the world of good. I've got to be honest, this is something that I feel that I've done for too long. And that's in many ways what this podcast is about. How do we play big and try and be the best versions of ourselves, but in the context of helping others? Now, being 4 episodes into this podcast, already these ideas are beginning to crystallize for me and develop more. The more we can develop our own identity and become a more complete version of ourselves, the more we can distill our key messages, avoid unwarranted negativity, and succinctly package the solutions for other people, therefore increasing the likelihood of promulgating those messages and to be able to help more people. And I want you to join me on that journey too. So if there's any way that I can help you, get in touch, email me, hit me up on social media. I'll put all my details up at easygoingdigital.com.au/individuate. Let's be part of a giant chain reaction of positivity.